welcome in everyone to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. We are going to start talking a little bit about the NFL Draft, give you a little bit of a reaction from that, break down which teams won the day both on the NFL side and the college football side of things, give you my favorite picks from round to round. We'll go through a ton of stuff, so we'll break all that down in the first segment. Then we'll get to some spring game reactions, a little bit of a reaction show today. We'll get some reactions from Oregon, from Colorado, from Nebraska, where Dylan Raiola really burst onto the scene. Then we will get into a little bit of a transfer portal update and all the people that have committed over the last couple of days because it was a very, very busy weekend. And then we'll finish it off with a Good Vibes Monday, get you guys started off on the right foot. And we'll talk about some of the best stories coming out of the NFL Draft. Tons of guys that have overcome injuries, overcome some very, very intense circumstances to get to where they are today and hear their name called. So I wanted to highlight some of those stories for you all. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to have kind of a fun experience here, have a fun back and forth, maybe call me out if I didn't cover something that I probably should have. But yeah, definitely use that if you would like to ask a question or a comment. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump right in. We have so much to get to, and let's start with the NFL Draft, the thing that was dominating the weekend for a lot of us. A lot of people, including myself, were obviously watching throughout the entire thing, and there were a lot of things that happened throughout the weekend that I really wanted to get through. Now, we'll get to the quarterbacks tomorrow, likely breaking down their situations and who I think found themselves into the best situation possible, who I think might struggle in their new situation. We'll break all that down tomorrow, so I wanted to highlight some other positions and some other things for the time being. But let's start with the wide receivers, because there is so much going on with that wide receiver class. We knew that it was remarkably talented when we came into the weekend, and that proved to be true. We had tons of guys go in the first round. The first four went exactly how you would expect. We had Marvin Harrison Jr. go first, followed by Malik Neighbors, Rome Odunze, and then Brian Thomas Jr., all incredibly talented guys. Those are the top four guys that I had in this class. And then you had Xavier Worthy go 5, which was the expectation from a lot of people. So the top guys relatively went in the order you would expect, especially when the Chiefs moved up. You just felt like it was going to be Xavier Worthy. That's a Andy Reid special, so you felt like that was going to be the pick there, and that's what it ended up being. Then things got a little bit interesting from the wide receiver position, and a lot of things went a lot of different directions. So let's start with Ricky Pearsall at 31 to the 49ers, one I did not expect at all. And then you had Xavier Legette going at 32 to the Panthers, one that was a little bit surprising, especially, the Panthers trading up into the first round. I thought they might look for someone like A.D. Mitchell, who has those sure hands, who is a very good player, but at the end of the day, Xavier Legette is a fantastic player and does incredible things on the football field. And also is a Carolina kid. If you saw his interviews, you saw that he's going to fit in just fine over there in the Panther organization. So I think that'll be a great fit, but definitely was a little bit surprising to me. We got Keon Coleman right out of the start, out of the first round, going to the Bills, who had a great press conference as well. Ladd McConkey and Jalen Polk both went very, very early to the Chargers and the Patriots, respectively. But then a guy fell that way further than a lot of people expected him to. We had A.D. Mitchell waiting all the way until pick 52, when a lot of people thought he was going to be a first-round pick. Absolutely wild stuff, something that I did not expect. I thought he was going to be a first-round pick. Him being wide receiver 11 in this class is not the case, is absolutely insane to me. But at the end of the day, he was not the person that got the worst of the having to wait. Troy Franklin and Brendan Rice absolutely had to wait way longer than I expected them to wait, and way longer than they probably should have. Now, Troy Franklin did get a little bit of a break. He was supposed to go on the second day, but did not have to wait long for his name to be called on Saturday. Only, I think the second pick in the 4th round, if I'm not mistaken, right after Jatavion Sanders went. But I think he was the one that, in my opinion, should have gone on the second day and is a remarkable receiver, but did not have to wait nearly as long as Brendan Rice did. Brendan Rice had to wait all the way till the 7th round until the Chargers took him. I honestly thought this was a 4th round, maybe a 5th round guy, but probably a 4th round. Even you could argue me into a 3rd round guy because the physical ability is just off the charts. I was very, very surprised he fell as far as they did. But it worked out into the Chargers' favor because they got a really good player at a position they very much needed. We had 7 offensive tackles taken in the first round, which we talked about on Friday, 10 others taken on the second day. So this was obviously a remarkable group. There definitely were some ers and ahs added into what ended up being kind of the order that I think a lot of people expected, with Joe Alt leading them off, Olufashanu, Talisi Fuaga, all of those guys following up. But you had Patrick Paul from Houston going in the second round to the Dolphins. Not necessarily what I expected. A very talented kid, but definitely expected him to go a little bit later than he ended up going. And then Christian Jones went in the 5th round to the Cardinals, someone I expected to go a little bit earlier. We will talk about him a little bit later when it comes to good stories, because this kid has absolutely battled to get to where he is right now. But I like both of those picks. It was just not necessarily the order that I saw those guys going necessarily. But let's get to kind of my biggest takeaways from the weekend, and let's start with my favorite picks of the weekend. We had so many great picks throughout every round, but I thought I would give 2 per round, give you guys an idea of where my eyes kind of, burst open, where I got really wide-eyed and saw, oh my god, that guy was still on the board type of thing. So in the first round, I talked about it a little bit on Friday, and had someone else other than Quinyon Mitchell here, I believe. But I had Troy Fautanu and Quinyon Mitchell as the 2 ones here. I think these guys are remarkable talents. Troy Fautanu, getting him at 20 at the Steelers is just an absolute steal. And then Quinyon Mitchell is a dude that I think is going to be a huge piece for that Eagles back end that is getting a little bit older. Some guys will be walking out the door pretty soon, namely Darius Slay. And you're going to have to have guys that come in right after him. They also got Cooper DeJean, which we'll get to here in a second, but very, very good pick by them, and I think someone that easily could have gone in the early teens, and I wouldn't have batted an eye because this guy is just so remarkably athletic. Round 2, I talked about it. Getting Adonai Mitchell at 52 is just insane for the Colts, an absolutely great value for them. And then Enos Rakestraw Jr. At 61 to the Lions. Absolutely huge pickup. That Lions back end is going to be absolutely mean. They are going to hit people very, very hard over and over. You have Brian Branch, you have Terrion Arnold, you have Enos Rakestraw, you have Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. So many guys that are going to absolutely fly downhill and just make this for a very, very interesting dynamic in the NFC North. I think they're going to be a very, very scary defense this next year. But round 3, I thought Jalen McMillan at 92 to the Buccaneers was a fantastic pick. This is a guy that has a very, very versatile route tree and can give really, really good hands. So I think he's someone that's going to be really hard to keep off the roster, mainly just because you need to put as many guys around Baker Mayfield that are sure-handed, that can make those plays when he absolutely needs them, and Jalen McMillan is absolutely one of those guys. And then Peyton Wilson, honestly one of the best picks in the entire draft. If you were to ask me, getting him at 98 to the Steelers is just remarkable. This is a dude that can play a ton of different positions, whether you want him to play linebacker, edge rusher, doesn't necessarily matter. He can do it all. He's a remarkably talented kid, and I think the Steelers, it might not be this year where he reaches his full potential, but I mean, with all the guys around him to learn from, whether it's TJ Watt or all of the linebackers that are there right now, I mean, he has plenty of resources to become the player that he can be, and that's a really, really good player for the Steelers for quite some time. But let's move on to the 4th round. Brandon Dorless at 109 to the Falcons. Frankly, one of the few picks the Falcons I felt like did not reach for a prospect, actually got someone of real value that was a little bit further down than I thought he would be. This is a guy that can rush the passer. This is a guy that is super athletic, can do the run, or the is good against the run. I lost my words there. He's good against the run, but his real attribute is his pass rushing, is his athleticism at the line of scrimmage. So a huge pickup for the Falcons, where they definitely went after defensive tackle, but I think this is by far the best pick they made at that position. And then you got TJ Tampa at 130 to the Ravens, a very, very talented guy that definitely should have gone sooner in the draft. This is a guy that I imagine in a Ravens uniform for quite some time, making a ton of incredible plays on the back end. Didn't necessarily love the Ravens draft overall, but I thought this was a fantastic pick by them. Round 5 had some really good players that went earlier in round 5, but definitely waited longer than I thought they should have. Cam Hart from Notre Dame was a really good corner last year, went 140 to the Chargers, a great pickup for them. I think he's a guy that could develop into a number 1 cornerback at the next level, to be totally honest with you. Austin Booker, an edge rusher from Kansas, made his way to the Bears at 144. A very, very good, talented kid, a very deep rush package that can get on the field pretty early and then slowly work out some of the kinks that he does have in his game, but can become a very long time and great rusher for the Bears in the future. And then you get to round 6 and you get kind of the diamonds in the rough, as it were, and I think there were a number of guys that were still sitting on the board that needed to be snapped up, and Mekhi Wingo was probably at the top of that list. He went 189 to the Lions. Very, very talented kid out of LSU, a guy that might need a little bit of time to kind of get there fully in terms of a pass rush package and being the player that he can be at the NFL level. But being at the Lions gives him plenty of time to do that, and I think that's a remarkable pick by them. Will Reichert at 203 to the Vikings was another pick that I know whenever someone picks a kicker, it looks a little bit interesting, but at the end of the day, you absolutely need that position in place, and you don't want to leave it up to chance whether he wants to sign with you guys or he wants to sign with someone else in free agency. So Will Reichert is a guy that you absolutely need to get your hands on, and I expect him to be the kicker in Minnesota for quite some time, to be totally honest with you. And then the 7th round, Trey Taylor, I came in saying this is one of my favorite players in the entire draft. I think this is a safety that can absolutely fly downhill. You can work him in so many different circumstances. Not the best in coverage necessarily, but a very, very hard hitter and can definitely help in the run game a ton. So very much like that pick at 223 to the Raiders. And then finally, Jaheim Bell at 231 to the Patriots. I think this is just get an athlete in the building and then figure out where he fits later. I think it's a great piece for someone like Drake May, who sometimes can get himself into trouble. This guy will be a great bailout type receiver or tight end in this scenario, but someone that he can just kind of find wherever he is on the field and dump it off to him and let him make a play, because the after catch ability is off the charts for this kid. But that's just an idea of who kind of stood out to me round by round. But let's get to kind of the winners and losers as I see it through this draft. Now, a lot of this is kind of splitting hairs between a couple of draft picks that I didn't like or a couple of draft picks I did like. So if your team is on the losers list, don't get too mad at me. If they're on the winners list, don't get too excited, because there's definitely a lot going on here. But there are a couple of teams that really stood out to me. The Colts, honestly, are at the very top of the list. Getting Liatu Latu and Adonai Mitchell where they did is just remarkable value, and they continued on having a great class, but those two guys in particular are absolutely going to be difference makers for them this year and beyond. So huge pickup for them. The same thing with the Steelers. You got Troy Fautanu, you got Peyton Wilson, both guys that I assumed will be in Pittsburgh for quite some time, be difference makers on both sides of the ball, and just be incredible pieces for Mike Tomlin and that staff. The Chargers getting two guys at a position of need in wide receiver. They got Ladd McConkey and Brendan Rice. I think they got both of those guys a little bit under where they're valued. Obviously, Brendan Rice well under where he's valued in my eyes, but Ladd McConkey even, I think he's a first-round talent. He ended up falling to the second round, able to snap him up. I think both those guys are just absolutely great pickups. For the Eagles, getting Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean is absolutely an embarrassment of riches. I think this was probably the two best secondary players in this entire class. Now, Terrion Arnold will have a lot to say about that, but I think getting those two guys is absolutely huge for that back end going forward. And then the Commanders, I think you started with Jaden Daniels, you got your quarterback, and then you just filled up with athletes throughout the entirety of the draft. You got Mike Sandristrow from Michigan. You got Ben Sinnott, who's a remarkable player that will play kind of an H-back type role. He can play fullback, tight end. He can do a lot of different things. I view him kind of as a Kyle Juszczyk type player at the next level, but he can do any number of things at the next level. So I think this was a great draft for the Commanders, just getting as much talent in the building and then figuring out how it all fits together a little bit later. For the losers, I think the Falcons kind of lead this one. Tons of reaches in this draft. Not necessarily a win-now draft as I saw it. I thought the Brandon Dorless pick that we got into was a great pick. I thought Braylon Trice was a great pick. But beyond that, it felt like a lot of guys that is going to need a little bit of time to get on the field. And when you just sign Kirk Cousins to a big contract, you kind of want to win immediately. But at the end of the day, I think it could turn into a great class. Just right now, it looks a little bit fuzzy from where I'm standing. The Cowboys, in my opinion, had a relatively okay draft, but that wide receiver need, I think, was big, and they didn't address it early enough. The same thing with the running back. It felt like there were tons of guys on the board they could have used their pick for and could have been more than happy with, but they decided to kind of kick the can down the road. Now, I love the Marshawn Nealon pick. I think Tyler Guyton is going to be a good player, although it'll take him a little bit of time. But at the end of the day, I just think overall this draft, missed in a couple of places that they absolutely could have hit. And then the Jets, not a ton of picks to work with, so not nearly as mad about the Jets one as some of these other ones. I think getting Braylon Allen where they did was a huge pickup in terms of pass pro and just having that running back to go alongside Breece Hall and kind of take some of the earnest off him. But overall, it just felt like this was a relatively underwhelming draft for them. Nothing necessarily egregiously bad, but didn't necessarily have the juice that I was looking for necessarily. The Vikings, this is one where I just don't necessarily love the first round they put together. Now, I think J.J. McCarthy can be successful. I think Dallas Turner can be successful. I just think both of those guys are a little bit of a toss-up, and you kind of have to make sure that they're in the right situation to make them succeed. So I'm a little bit nervous about that. The only real pick for the Vikings that I am sure will make an impact for them in the future, or at least a long time in the future, is Will Reichard, the kicker. So not necessarily, it definitely could turn into a remarkable class for the Vikings, especially with those two top guys. I'm just not necessarily as confident that both of those guys will hit the way that maybe some Vikings fans are. And then finally, the Ravens. I thought they stretched a little bit for Nate Wiggins, in my opinion. I thought there were some other guys on the board that they could have snapped up that would have been a little bit better of fits. I think Cooper DeJean is one of those guys, but I think TJ Tampa was a great way to make up for that later in the draft. But overall, it was just kind of an underwhelming draft for the Ravens. Definitely some good picks mixed in there, but not necessarily what I expected from them this time around. But finally, let's get to college football, and let's talk about what teams in college football won the draft. And it's the team that you would expect. Michigan led everyone with 13 guys drafted. Now, they only had one guy in the first round after getting 13 guys drafted, so absolutely insane that they were able to get that much out of the talent, because at the end of the day, when you looked at that Michigan team, you saw plenty of talent. It's not necessarily that they were struggling for that by any means, but they weren't necessarily on the level of some of the teams that they were playing. Not on the level of the Ohio States or Alabama. The teams that they played, there were some where they were just athletically outmatched, and they still found a way to win. So gives you an idea of the remarkable coaching that was at play, the remarkable leadership that was at play in that program, and kind of gives you an idea of, the replacement that needs to be made at that program this upcoming year. You had the playoff teams fill out the top four, with Florida State being right there with the teams that they were fighting with, or the one team that they were fighting with, really, in Alabama. Georgia continues to pump guys into the NFL. 8 guys taken. You had Oregon and Penn State join them there. Now, Georgia could have had a couple other guys taken, to be totally honest with you, but some guys stuck around that will definitely pay dividends in 2024. Then you had Notre Dame and USC, two teams that, frankly, I expected a little bit more from last year, especially USC with Caleb Williams, but at the end of the day, got plenty of guys into the NFL draft and should be successful this next year, just especially Notre Dame in particular, but it might be an uphill battle for USC a little bit. Ohio State being at 4 is something that shows you just how many guys decided to come back. That number could have easily been up near 8 or 9, depending on how many defensive and offensive players found their way into the draft, because there were guys on that team that absolutely would have been drafted in this class, whether it's Jack Sawyer or Denzel Burke. You can go down the list. There's so many guys that would have been drafted, decided to come back, and it shows you just how important this season is for Ohio State. But the biggest winner by fairly comfortable margin in my eyes is Texas, and I think everyone kind of agrees with that. They set a school record with 11 draft picks just 2 years after getting 0 drafted. So it gives you an idea of how much Sark has absolutely flipped that program on its head, created it to what it should be, right? To the Texas that a lot of people remember, me not so much, to be totally honest with you, but I think he's brought them back to where they probably belong, at the top of college football and the top of the NFL draft year over year. And then just to give you an idea of how well he's built this roster, they lost 11 guys, they lost a ton of receivers, and they have the second highest production going into next year in the SEC. So it's not like the cupboard is empty. It's not like they're losing everyone. So just gives you an idea of what Sark has done in such a short time over there. And if he can keep the thing rolling this year, I think it's going to be really, really hard to stop going forward. But finally, let's get to kind of a conference breakdown. The Power 5 conferences absolutely dominated the day. You had the SEC obviously up top. Then the Pac-12 had a very, very good end to their tenure with 43 guys taken. Big Ten, ACC right there with 42 and 41. And then you had the Big 12 down there with 31. So definitely a great group for the Power 5 conferences. The Group of 5 struggled a little bit, and that makes total sense. There's definitely guys that it feels like that gap is growing even more and more. Another thing that pushes me more and more towards the Group of 5 playoff possibly. But at the end of the day, definitely a pretty distinct gap forming, and it's forming even more and more. But at the end of the day, as you look at this draft, it's what we've seen a lot. And we'll break down kind of how it relates to recruiting and stuff throughout the week, because there were some very interesting numbers coming out of that with, when we talk about star ratings and some people say it doesn't matter, maybe it does, and we'll get into that a little bit tomorrow. But we're going to take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the spring games. There were tons of stuff going on this weekend. We're going to zero in on Nebraska, Oregon, and Colorado. Those were the teams that really had a lot come out of their spring games that I wanted to get into, so we will break that down right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows where 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just broke down a little bit of the NFL draft, gave you some of my biggest takeaways, my favorite picks, some of the teams that won the day, some of the teams that did not win the day, and then some college football teams that really benefited over the weekend. But let's get to some spring games. There is tons going on still in the spring game calendar. We still have a couple of games coming down the road, although this was the last weekend that we had a ton of stuff going on. I totally forgot to preview these games on Friday, got really caught up in all the NFL draft talk, but let's break down a couple of the takeaways from these games, and let's start in Nebraska And let's start with Dylan Raiola, because he was the guy that everyone was talking about coming into this game, and he was absolutely the guy that they were talking about coming out of this game. Went 16 for 22, 238 yards and 2 touchdowns. His team won the game 25-21. He had an absolutely beautiful ball to Jalen Lloyd for a 64-yard touchdown. It showed everything that this guy is capable of, and he looked absolutely insanely comfortable in the pocket, something that is not necessarily a given when a freshman quarterback is coming into the fray, but that dude looks absolutely comfortable navigating any situation. On that 64-yard ball, he had to step up into a pocket that was a little bit collapsing and found a way to make that pass get where it needed to go, and just a remarkable performance by that kid. And I think Nebraska fans have to be very pumped about that. You have your guy for the next number of years, at least 3 years. You have this guy likely as your starting quarterback, and it's not that the other guys in the room are not talented. Dalen Kalen, another guy that was an early enrollee, went 9 for 16 with 91 yards. The incumbent starter, Henrik Harburg, went 8 for 13 with 163 yards and 2 scores. So it's not that the cupboard is bare by any means, and you have to push Dylan Raiola into the spotlight, but he's absolutely earned that spotlight, and I think he's the guy that absolutely will be trotting out with the first team around this time in the fall, and I think he will be a huge quarterback for them. Now, he will have some growing pains, but it was obviously a fantastic day for Nebraska fans, and hopefully will be a fantastic fall for them with Dylan Raiola. But let's get to a couple of injuries that happened throughout the day. Demetrius Bell and Bly Hill, two guys. Wide receiver Demetrius Bell went down after he only had a catch and 7 yards, so was not in the game for very long. Went down, had to be carted off, was not a good situation. And then you had Bly Hill kind of in the same situation. Both are kind of undergoing testing. We'll figure out more about those injuries down the road, but it sounded like Matt Rule was not necessarily super optimistic. Now, a lot of things can change, and we don't really know what happens until those tests come through, so don't want to necessarily speak in uncertainties here by any means, but definitely not the greatest thing for a spring game. But that wide receiver group is more than talented, so it's not necessarily a super big worry. Malachi Coleman and Isaiah Garcia Constaneda, were out for the spring, so they are still recovering from injuries, did not play. Isaiah Nair, the transfer from Texas, definitely showed off his ability during this game. Jamal Banks, the transfer from Wake Forest, showed off his ability, and definitely is the guy that I would expect to be the wide receiver one for this group, a very talented kid that can do a number of different things. Running back looked really solid. Dante Dowdle, the Oregon transfer, was getting the majority of the carries, had 76 yards on 7 carries, a very, very talented kid, someone that can do a ton of really, really good things, was just kind of buried behind a number of really good running backs over there at Oregon, so finally getting his shot in the spotlight and taking full advantage right now. You also had Gabe Irving and Raheem Johnson from injury. All of those guys are going to be really, really talented. And then you got Emmett Johnson and Quinton Ives, all guys that can play a part for them. But Dante Dowdle is probably where it starts for that running game in the fall. Nebraska also had 2 turnovers in a 97-play scrimmage. Last year they had about 8. So it shows you the difference in taking care of the ball, making sure that everything is exactly where it needs to be, because as we know with Nebraska, some of the games that they have lost, they absolutely should not have lost. They lost it themselves. They did not get beat by any means. They gave it away in some circumstances. So that is going to be a huge thing for them, especially with a rookie quarterback. One of them was the pass hit receiver, and it just bounced off him into defender's hands. Now the ball was a little bit behind the receiver, but at the end of the day, some of that stuff it kind of is up in the air, right? But not a ton to speak of from the defense. Not necessarily to say that they had a really bad day, although wasn't necessarily great. I do think that it'll be a fine group. It just is not the strength of that team right now, for sure. But let's move on over to Oregon. Let's talk about the Oregon Ducks. That quarterback room is outright unfair. We were talking about last week when Jaden Rashada signed with Georgia. That might be the best quarterback room in the country. Well, Oregon heard that, and they decided to put on an absolute show. And it wasn't just Dylan Gabriel and Dante Moore, who were fantastic. Dylan Gabriel completed 2/3 of his passes, 163, 2 touchdowns. Dante Moore went 11 for 16, 87 yards, had a 60-yard touchdown that was wiped off the board. So plenty of talent on that front two lines. But then you had Austin Novosad, who had a very, very good game, someone that Oregon fans saw a little bit of last year, didn't necessarily play quite as well as you would have hoped, but was a freshman, is getting back into the groove of things, and looks a lot better. Went 12 for 22, 177 yards, and was definitely very, very talented. Had the most yards of any quarterback on the roster during this game. And then Luke Moaga had a couple of plays. He's an incoming freshman. Had a couple of plays that made Oregon Twitter very, very excited about this kid. Definitely gave off some Marcus Mariota vibes during this game, but a very, very talented group that goes about 4 deep at this point. So I don't think Oregon fans have to worry about quarterback for quite some time, to be totally honest, up in Eugene. The running back room looked really solid as well. They had a ton of guys that showed out. Jordan James is obviously going to be the number one back there, but they have tons of other guys that have made a big time effect throughout the early parts of this spring camp and into the summer and into fall. But I think they have plenty of guys at that room. They have plenty of guys that can make tons of big time plays, and whether it's running the ball or receiving. So this room should be more than fine, if we're being totally honest. I think Jaden Harris, I believe is his first name. I left off his first name here, but he was the player of the game in a lot of people's eyes and will likely be the backup running back this upcoming year. Definitely adds some different parts to that offense, so very excited for this running back room. I think a group that losing someone like Bucky Irving is not ideal, but they replaced him just fine with the group that they have, and I think they'll be able to run the ball just fine this upcoming year. The D-line was a huge question mark going into spring and kind of throughout spring, but they looked dominant. They looked like they absolutely dominated the offensive line throughout most of the day. A ton of really good plays. Ben Roberts was the one that made a huge impact in particular. Had 2 tackles and a sack. Was definitely a huge part of that defensive front, kind of winning the day. Had 5 total sacks throughout the day, although some of those probably could have been more, but it was a non-contact day for the QBs, obviously. So although it was non-contact for the QBs, was not for everyone else. So definitely left with some injuries and some rather big ones. You had Kobe Savage go down after a tough hit to Jordan James. You had Dante Manning walk to the locker room after an injury. You had Trayshawn Holden go out with an injury. So tons of guys that you absolutely need on the field that did not have the Saturday they had planned. Jerrion Dickey, another one that is coming in and has a huge amount of hype coming into this season. But at the end of the day, hopefully all those guys can get healthy. Plenty of time for them to do that, but not what you want to see by any means if you're Oregon. But hopefully, that doesn't become a problem into fall, but those are some tough injuries to watch for sure. But finally, let's get to primetime and the Buffs. Let's talk about Colorado. Weather did not necessarily cooperate for Dion and the Buffs. They definitely had to deal with some rain throughout this game, but Shedeur had a really solid day. Despite the rain, he went 10 for 14, 166 yards and a touchdown. It felt like a guy that he was going to consistently throughout this game was LaJohntay Wester, the transfer from FAU, a very talented kid. I expect him to be their number one wide receiver this upcoming year, even with guys like Jimmy Horn Jr. and Omarion Miller and Travis Hunter. All of those guys are going to be incredible. I think LaJohntay Wester is going to be the best of them, and I think they absolutely need him to be the best, just because when you have Travis Hunter playing both sides of the ball, where corner is likely where he's going to be spending most of his time at the next level, they'll probably push him a little bit further in that direction this year. Omarion Miller is a great player, but probably needs a little bit more time to come on. Jimmy Horn Jr. makes plays kind of sporadically, but is a really good player that can help fill the gaps, but you need that clear wide receiver one that is only playing wide receiver that, doesn't have to play both sides of the ball like Travis Hunter does, and I think LaJohntay Wester is an absolutely great pickup for that. Running back room was a weird group to watch, to be totally honest with you. They had 3 running backs leave in the portal. Added in a couple of guys. Dallin Hayden from Ohio State is coming in, as is Rashad Amos from Miami of Ohio, who we'll talk about in the next segment. But at the end of the day, they did have to start a freshman cornerback, Isaiah Harge, at running back for this game. So not the situation that you want if you're a Colorado fan, but bringing in those two guys from the portal should be huge. And as long as those guys can become who they're capable of being, then this run game should be okay. It just did not look what it's going to look like in the fall on Saturday. But the O-line is definitely the one that everyone was watching, and it looks like the haul that Dion brought in seems to be working out pretty okay. They had Jordan Seaton starting, that remarkably talented freshman, had Tyler Brown, I'll do my best, Hank Zelinskas, Jeremy Mayers, and Khalil Benson, all very new guys to this program, and definitely will have to play a huge part in them going forward. They did not allow many pressures throughout the game, so only allowed one sack. Definitely a very, very encouraging performance. Maybe it has more to do with the D-line, I don't know, but definitely an encouraging performance after the offensive line was just downright terrible a year ago. So definitely a lot of moving parts there, but hopefully they can put together a good five and keep Shadur upright, because as long as you can do that, he is pretty remarkable, I'll be honest. Again, not a ton to talk about with the defense in this one. They're still kind of fighting an uphill battle there, still tons to bring in. They brought in a couple of guys through the portal over the last couple of days that will definitely help out, but definitely need some more reinforcements there. Then finally, another headline that came out was Dion saying that he is going to be in Boulder for quite some time, saying he will not be following his kids to the NFL, and I do believe he will not follow Shadur to the NFL, but I'm not necessarily sure if I believe him about this, to be totally honest with you. I think coaches, obviously that's what you're going to say, you're fully committed to that program, but when the right offer comes along, it's hard to pass that up. But we'll see what happens there. Maybe he's fully committed, and if he is, Colorado is in for a very, very interesting next decade or so if he's really, really committed to this program. So it'll be really interesting to watch all of that unfold, but spring games are always a very interesting thing, kind of a zero-sum game, but I believe Washington still has one to come. Wisconsin is another one, I believe, still has one to come. So possibly another one of these segments coming up, but definitely winding down on spring practice and getting into that summer kind of lull that we get into, but plenty of content still coming down the pipe, so don't worry about that. But we're going to take our second break here, and when we come back, we got to talk about the transfer portal. There have been tons of stuff going on. We have tons of commits to break down, including one of the biggest guys in the portal committing, and then we have some intel that we want to break down, particularly around the defensive tackle position. So we will break all that down right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. Wow, my hair is all over the place. Welcome back everyone. We just talked about a little bit of a update from the spring games that went on this weekend. Definitely some interesting things coming out, specifically from Nebraska, with Dylan Raiola being just incredible this weekend. But let's get some transfer portal talk. There has been so much going on, especially this past weekend. We had tons of guys committing, including 2 guys up at the top of the portal class that I definitely want to get to. But let's give you an idea of where we sit right now with the transfer portal class that is still out there to be had. But there were some commitments that rolled in that I want to break down real quick here. Damian Martinez is officially a Miami Hurricane, something we had expected for quite some time, honestly, but he is officially Miami, and a huge pickup for Miami. They absolutely needed a more potent running game, And they did not stop there. It was a absolutely huge weekend for Miami. They got Sam Brown, a wide receiver from Houston, the top rated wide receiver that was available in the portal, so a huge pickup. Again, was talking about a little bit earlier with Miami. Definitely need a couple more receivers just to fill out that room a little bit more. Sam Brown can do that and more, so a huge pickup for them. They did not stop there on the offensive side of the ball, though. They got two guys on the defensive side of the ball that will be huge for them. Jalen Alderman, a linebacker from Louisville, is a fantastic player that played great for Louisville a year ago. Definitely a position that Miami needed a little bit of help on, especially from a depth perspective. And then you had someone like Deonnie Hill, a cornerback from Marshall. Both great pickups, definitely positions where they absolutely needed some help from a depth perspective, but also some of these guys are going to be forced to be the guys that you absolutely need them to be from the jump. And I think Jalen Alderman is definitely that guy. He's definitely someone that you're going to have to watch out for, because he's going to be huge to the success of Miami, especially on the defensive side of the ball this upcoming year. But we talked about Damian Martinez. The other top running back is off the board. Dylan Edwards is heading to Kansas State, something that we had kind of hinted at a little bit. Him and Avery Johnson are former youth teammates, so have known each other for quite some time. Them teaming up is absolutely insane. This run game is going to be insane. You have Avery Johnson, you have Dylan Edwards now, and you have DJ Giddens, who are just all remarkable runners. As long as Avery Johnson can make the right choices when it comes to the RPO game and the read option game, they're going to be really tough to cover. Near impossible to cover on the ground, to be totally honest with you. Just a remarkable group that I think could do really, really insane things at Kansas State this year. Rashad Amos, we talked about earlier, was committed to Mississippi State from Miami of Ohio, is now making his way to Colorado after the Buffs lost some players at that position that they absolutely needed. Mississippi State is hosting Devon Booth from Utah State in hopes to replace Amos, so they've already moved on to finding someone new, but definitely a tough blow for the Bulldogs there. Jay Fair, a wide receiver from Auburn, has found his way to USC after a very short visit this weekend, so a huge pickup for them, definitely someone that they're going to need. Lost a ton of wide receiver help, whether it's Todd Washington or Brendan Rice or any of the number of guys that they lost throughout this offseason. Definitely need some help at that position, and Jay Fair will be a huge player for them. But let's get to some intel about some of the guys that are on this list here. And let's start with defensive tackle, the most highly sought-after group and probably the deepest group in the class right now. And Dominic Williams is probably the biggest name in the group. It seems like Texas still is leading pretty comfortably in this one. That being said, Oklahoma just did a big thing this weekend. They offered his little brother Joshua. Definitely a move you will see a lot in recruiting. When you want the older brother, you offer the younger brother, and you hope that they come as a package deal type of thing. Definitely a veteran move by Brent Venables and company. Don't know if it'll end up working for them, but I understand fully what they're doing there. And then Simeon Barrow Jr. is another guy to watch. It feels like Miami is leading pretty comfortably for this guy. I feel like Miami has been the team that just keeps popping up every time that I read something about him. So definitely want to keep an eye out on that. LSU is also pushing very hard, as they are for pretty much every defensive tackle in this entire class. They're going after guys like CJ West, although he was over there at Wisconsin this past weekend. So tons of different movement going on. Derek Harmon, another guy from Michigan State to watch. Around all of these teams, whether it's Miami, LSU, or Wisconsin. I think all of these teams are in for pretty much all of these guys, just because that need is huge. LSU is the team that really, really needs some of these guys to come into the group, because it's going to be tough if they can't bring in at least a couple of these guys and help out that defensive front a little bit, because it's a rough group right now, and if you can't defend the run in the SEC, you are in a lot of trouble. So LSU will definitely be a team to watch, as well as Miami, as this thing kind of winds down. Everything finishes up here at the end of the day tomorrow. So definitely winding down on all the names that will jump in, but not winding down on the work to be done and recruiting these kids. So we'll definitely continue to keep you updated, especially on the defensive tackle class. But Wisconsin is still making some moves in the portal. They had Elijah Badger, the top wide receiver from Arizona State a year ago, on campus this past week. Definitely would be a huge pickup for them, someone they absolutely would love to get on campus. Florida is also pushing for him. It would make a great duo between him and Trey Wilson if they could get him in the group, and would definitely be a very, very interesting group to watch with Florida. They continue to improve, it feels like, down there in Gainesville, and no one seems to be watching, which is probably the way they like it. But we'll break down that as it kind of happens. I think Florida might have the slight edge, but we'll see what happens there. It sounds like Penny Boone will actually not be a Kentucky Wildcat after all. I fully expected him to commit at some point this weekend, but Nick Rush over at KSR Plus has said there are some academic hurdles for him. He can't transfer enough credit hours over to Kentucky for it to make sense for him to transfer there. So it doesn't look like he is going to be a Wildcat after all. I know that UGA was another team that was in on him, but I got to be honest, if the academics were a trouble at Kentucky, they're likely a trouble at Georgia as well. So it'll be interesting to watch to see what happens with him. He's a very, very talented kid that I hope finds a place to play football, but doesn't sound like it's going to be in Lexington with the Wildcats. And then let's get to Khalil Jacobs, a linebacker from South Alabama that absolutely should be on this list, but accidentally left him off here. He's taking a visit to a number of SEC schools this week. He's starting in Auburn tomorrow. He will then move on to Missouri, I believe on Thursday or maybe Wednesday, I can't exactly remember, before heading back to his former head coach in Kane Womack in Tuscaloosa. Definitely would be a huge pickup for any of these teams, but in particular Auburn, I feel like needs that help in the interior or in the middle of that defense. Would be a huge pickup for them, but obviously with Kane Womack in Tuscaloosa gives them a little bit of the upper hand, even with having guys like Deontay Lawson and Jahad Campbell holding down those linebacker positions as of right now in Tuscaloosa. Miami is definitely the team that you're going to want to watch throughout these next couple of days. Obviously, the names will stop rolling in after tomorrow night, but doesn't mean the craziness will stop by any means. There are still tons of guys that will be on the board that will still be being recruited. Cormani McClain has a situation that is very confusing right now. It sounds like there's not a ton of big-time teams, at least, that are really after him very aggressively. Definitely not the situation that he expected, but overall, I think Miami is definitely the team to watch, although there are plenty of teams that are going after plenty of these guys, so we'll keep you updated with everything as things go down. But Miami and KSU had huge weekends, and we'll definitely be looking to build off that going into the 2024 season. But that will do it for this segment about the transfer portal. Then when we come back from this break, I want to break down some of the best stories from the NFL draft. Tons of guys that have overcome injuries, overcome personal stories, overcome tons of stuff to hear their name called this weekend. So I want to break down some of the best stories from this weekend and just highlight those guys a little bit. So we will do that right after this break, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about a little bit of a transfer portal update, gave you guys an idea of where everything sits, had a couple of big time running backs come off the board, so definitely check that out if you haven't already. But let's get to a Good Vibes Monday, and let's talk about some of the best draft stories. I think the draft is awesome for a million different reasons, and I think a lot of people like to focus on the athletes and focus on the on-field consequences of what happens in that weekend, but the off-field consequences are even more impactful, and there's so many great stories that came out of this weekend. Obviously, I could spend an entire hour on all the stories that came out, but won't have time to do that today. But definitely some guys that I want to highlight that overcame injuries, that overcame some family issues, that overcame just being very low on the depth chart and having to battle and having to get through some stuff that would have been really tough for a lot of us to get through. So I wanted to highlight some of the kids, and let's start with Michael Penix Jr., someone that definitely made some headlines on Thursday, so a little bit of a head-scratcher pick from the Falcons there, and people have definitely been kind of going after it a little bit, and I understand definitely a pick that will get scrutinized a lot over the next little bit, but I don't want it to overshadow what this kid has kind of overcome to get to the point where he was picked number 8 overall. I mean, the kid had 2 torn ACLs, missed multiple years of football while at Indiana, transferred over to Washington, and just did not look back. Had a remarkable 2 years, a national championship appearance, was a Heisman finalist, did just about everything you could have asked him to do, and got himself into an 8th overall pick. I mean, it's just remarkable after being, pretty much an afterthought in college football, burst onto the scene in that year in Indiana, but then had some really, really tough luck. And the ability to battle back, the ability to find a new place to play, and not only, be able to play, be able to get on the field, but thrive the way that he did was just a remarkable thing to watch. And although that pick is a little bit head-scratching to a lot of people, and definitely to myself as well, to be totally honest with you, I think it's just remarkable what this kid has overcome, and it shows you why the Falcons fell in love with this kid so much, because you know that every time this kid steps on the football field, he doesn't take a second for granted, because he knows how quickly it can all be taken away from you, and how quickly you're sitting on the sideline and wishing you were out there. So he's someone that I totally understand how the Falcons fell in love with him. I think he is someone that a lot of those fans will fall in love with, despite some of the aggressive things you might see coming out of Atlanta Falcons fans' Twitters and mouths right now. But this is a kid that has overcome so much to get to where he is, and just felt like he definitely deserved some of that respect, and definitely deserved to be highlighted this way, because man, I can't imagine, tearing both your ACLs, having to battle back the way he did, and doing it, and not only doing it, to get back on the field, but become the 8th overall pick in the draft is something special for sure. Adisa Isaac is another guy that overcame an injury. He had to sit out the 2021 year with a torn Achilles, came back, made a huge impact, and is now a Baltimore Raven. Definitely a guy that I'm very excited to see at the next level. I think someone that, because of that injury, had a little bit left on the table in his college career, but definitely will be have the ability to reach his highest heights in Baltimore, so very excited for him. I think he's someone that I'm very much rooting for, just because I love his play style and love the way that he approaches the game. And then finally, a very interesting story around an injury that a lot of us remember, Zach Zinter going down with a fractured fibula and tibia, in the Ohio State game. It turns out they drafted Michael Hall Jr., who was involved in that. He kind of got thrown into Zach Zinter's leg and caused that injury. And Zach Zinter has obviously said there is no hard feelings. Michael Hall Jr., football is a dangerous game, and sometimes there are accidents that happen. So obviously a very unfortunate accident, but those two guys now that probably hated each other not too long ago, being Ohio State and Michigan guys, now get to compete against each other in practice and wear the same jersey and go to battle with each other. So two guys that were connected in not the greatest way in the world before, are now connected in definitely a better way than they were before. But then we've broken down, guys that have overcome injuries. Cooper DeJean is another guy that definitely deserves to be highlighted here, but there are other guys that have overcome other hurdles that, injuries are incredibly tough to overcome, but there are some guys that overcome much more to get to where they are today. And I think the biggest example is probably Jonathan Brooks, someone that has done an incredible job during his time at Texas, has overcome a lot, not only on the field, but off the field. He lost his father early in his life and has a tattoo that commemorates him on his forearm. So if you see him score, tap his forearm and point to the sky. He'll do that every time he scores, and you will know the meaning now. It's definitely a very, very cool story. They had a picture of him at the draft party, so he could be a part of the fun and definitely share that moment. You could see how much it meant to him and his family. So just a remarkable story of a kid that overcome something that a lot of us can't even imagine, right? So really huge props to him becoming the player that he is and becoming the guy that he is. And the Panthers definitely got a fantastic player in person in Jonathan Brooks. But some other guys that have overcome some things that have a little bit more to do with football rather than, what Jonathan Brooks went through. We had Cody Schrader, who was a great story this past year with Missouri, had found his way from Truman College, a very, very small school, to be a walk-on at Missouri, and is now a draft pick. So just a remarkable, remarkable story, a guy that absolutely worked his butt off and deserves all the love in the world for that. Another guy that absolutely worked his butt off is Christian Jones, the tackle out of Texas. The dude literally didn't play tackle football until junior year. He was a soccer player that did not even think about playing football, then played it in his junior year of high school, and 6 years later, he is a draft pick. He is in the NFL and has done remarkable work to become the player he is, because when Steve Sarkisian came in, there was a lot of people that were very nervous about this kid starting. And then by the end of his time, he was as dominant of an offensive tackle as there was in the entire Big 12, and got drafted and has done just remarkable things to improve his game. So huge props to him. Very excited to see him at the next level. Another Texas guy that has gone through a lot, kind of through the Texas turmoil, if you will, is Jordan Whittington. Someone that came in during Tom Herman's time, towards the end of Tom Herman's time, where they didn't have any running backs on the roster. Him and Roschon Johnson kind of took over some of the burden there, and then he was able to move back to wide receiver, became the absolute heartbeat of this team. And that was one of the reasons that Les Snead, the Rams GM, said that they picked him, was because every time that they talked to someone around Texas, they said, this kid is going to do everything that you want him to do in the exact right way. He is going to lift up your teammates, not only be a good guy on the field for you, but be a fantastic guy in the locker room. And he's overcome so much within that program, where it's been a crazy couple of years while he's been there, but being able to come out the other side and be a draft pick and live out that dream is just remarkable. So wanted to give him some props, and then some other really interesting moments, particularly from the Colts draft, that I want to break down real quick. One was from Chris Ballard, the GM, addressing kind of the negative rumors around Adonai Mitchell that possibly made him fall as far as they did in the draft. Honestly, ridiculous rumors. I'm not going to put any more out there, because I've seen nothing to make me believe that they are true. But at the end of the day, I think the way that Chris Ballard handled it was exactly how I would want it to be handled if I was Adonai Mitchell. Now, I won't repeat what he said, because I'd like to keep hosting the show, but at the end of the day, it's something that you don't see very often. You see a lot of these guys, talk very, very carefully and not say anything too aggressive, and Chris Ballard threw all that out the window and was definitely very, very intense. And I think it's something that kind of has to happen. You see all these different stories throughout the upcoming to the draft, and you see some stories where you're like, that's a little bit weird. I don't know. I haven't heard anything about him, and now all this stuff starts to come out. A lot of it's not true. And the Adonai Mitchell stuff particularly was very weird, and I don't know. It didn't sit right with me, and it definitely didn't sit right with Chris Ballard. So love to see someone, go out there that aggressively for one of their guys, and I'm sure Adonai Mitchell and his family really appreciated that as well, and he's ready to go play for that guy, that's for sure. But then another moment from the Colts draft that I thought was very funny and gives you an idea of what the NFL draft is like for these kids. When they called their 7th-round draft pick, Jonah Lualu from Utah, a very talented edge rusher that I think honestly was an absolute steal in the 7th round for them. But when he called them, he genuinely thought they were prank calling him. He genuinely thought he had to ask the question to Chris Ballard. He wanted to make sure that he was actually getting the call that he had waited so long for. I mean, it gives you an idea of how long these guys have to wait, how long it feels that they have to wait throughout that last day. And getting that call must be very, very special. But waiting that long definitely makes you think twice when you actually get that call. So tons of stuff to break down from this NFL draft. I mean, I only scratched the surface with some of the stories that can be unpacked here. I mean, we had Junior Colson getting drafted by his head coach from college, and Jim Harbaugh going over to the Chargers to join him. Tons of really cool stuff. We had the funny video that Drake May's brothers gave to him that was just incredible in every sense of the word. Absolutely loved that. I think there were just a remarkable amount of moments that you can break down from pretty much every NFL draft for quite some time now that are just make you feel good and make this moment that means so much to the kids and the families. It gives you an idea of just how much it is and just how much they've overcome to get to that point now. I could unpack number of kids that have overcome injuries, whether it's really tough ones or just minor ones that you have to keep working through. Guys that worked from walk-ons to an NFL draft pick, guys that have bounced around and finally found where they thrived and found their way into the draft. There are so many different stories that I could break down, but didn't quite have the time for that today. But we'll definitely continue to unpack these stories as they continue to pop up. But a huge shout out to all the guys that got drafted, a huge shout out to their family and friends. I mean, just a huge weekend for all of them, and it never gets old seeing those guys get that call and seeing them be celebrated that way. So a huge prop to them. Love this that weekend, and definitely had some good vibes coming out of that weekend watching all those guys get that call. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Tommy Brzee. As always, your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference for us. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all of the content and updates that we do. We have tons of people covering every sport you could possibly want, so we will definitely break down everything you could possibly need. Come on over to GSMC and we absolutely have you covered. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.